All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. We have two fascinating speakers today. Our Executive Director, Chris Costa, and he is joined today by retired U.S. Army General David H. Petraeus, former Director of the CIA. I'm sure you're familiar with General Petraeus's career, but to share a few highlights, he served over 37 years in the US military, culminating with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, including command of the surge in Iraq, command of US Central Command, and command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following retirement from the military and after Senate confirmation by a vote of 94-0, he headed the CIA during a period of significant achievements in the global war on terror, the establishment of important agency digital initiatives, and significant investments in the agency's human capital. General Petraeus graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy and is the only person in U.S. Army history to be the top graduate of both the demanding U.S. Army Ranger School and the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. He also earned a PhD from Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. Petraeus has earned numerous honors, awards, and decorations, including 4 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, 2 NATO Meritorious Service Medals, the Combat Action Badge, the Ranger Tab, and Master Parachutist and Air Assault badges. Petraeus is a partner in the global investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. It is truly an honor to have him with us today. One last thing before I turn this over to Chris, but it's very important. I want to share our special thanks to our sponsors. First, the Honorable Mary Beth Long, who serves on the International Spy Museum Board of Directors. She's an outstanding supporter of the museum. We really appreciate all she's done for us. And she's joined today in sponsorship by Accenture. Accenture Federal Services has been a contributing supporter to the Spy Museum throughout the pandemic and continuing as we all hopefully are healing. And we give special thanks to our governing board member, Tracy Easler, and Lieutenant General Mary Legere for championing that support. We cannot thank you enough, but you've heard enough from me. You are here to listen to these incredible men. So I will disappear and over to you, Chris.
Amanda, as always, thank you for the tremendous introduction. It is a privilege, of course, to have General Petraeus join us today for Spy Chat. I'm particularly excited about this program. However, we are going to depart ever so slightly from our regular format to ensure that we have more time to hear the General's insights this afternoon. We will have plenty of time for audience questions, but I have a few questions I want to ask right up front in light of the fact that this month's anniversary of the 9/11 attacks really calls attention to 20 years of a relentless counterterrorism campaign. So all of that said, General, based on your decades plus experience in the counterterrorism fight, what does the future Islamist extremist threat landscape look like in the years that lie ahead?
Well, thanks, Chris. First of all, it is great to be with you and great to be on Spy Chat. And with you, it's being reunited, of course, because we served together, in fact, in the context of the global war on terror at various junctures along the way, not the least of which is when you were at SOC CENT and I was the commander of US Central Command. I think the way to characterize the Islamist extremist threat that we face today is actually to take from the words, I think, of the president or secretary of state who have described it as having metastasized. There's no one center of that threat the way that there used to be when al-Qaeda had its sanctuary in Afghanistan and planned the 9/11 attacks there and which we had to then go in and eliminate. There's no Islamic State caliphate. That was eliminated when we went back into Iraq and into northeastern Syria and provided the advise, assist, and enabling campaign that helped the Iraqi security forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces eliminate that particular achievement, really, of the Islamic State that no extremist group had ever established before, a true caliphate that they were governing on the ground, and which was a major threat to our allies in Europe in particular. But what we do have now, we're faced by a number of different locations in which Al-Qaeda affiliates, the Islamic State affiliates are present. And we might discuss perhaps the lessons that we should have learned from this, but one of them is you have to not only keep an eye on them, you have to keep pressure on them. And as is required, you have to at least disrupt and degrade them if you're not able to defeat them with the kind of campaign that would be necessary for that. So we have, for example, in Africa, somewhere around 7,000 American troops that are engaged with host nation forces, with our NATO allies, France and Mali in particular, as an example. And we are indeed keeping an eye and pressure on those different groups, whether it's in Somalia, it's in Mali, it's in North Africa, West Africa, you name it. And again, this administration wisely has maintained that presence. They have maintained the presence necessary in Iraq to make sure that we help the Iraqi security forces and government keep an eye on the Islamic State. It no longer is an army. We help them defeat that and take away the caliphate. But there clearly are still Islamic State terrorist cells and insurgent cells as well, if you will, in certain respects. And in fact, we saw a particularly horrific attack recently up in northern Iraq in the area of Kirkuk. And then, of course, in Syria, yes, we've taken away the caliphate, or our Syrian Democratic Force partners did that with our assistance, and they're keeping an eye on them again with our help. But we cannot pull that out. And again, wisely, this administration has done that. Afghanistan is obviously a different story. You can relitigate that and offer, as I have, that there were alternatives that were quite affordable, and that the result there is not just heartbreaking and tragic, that it is actually disastrous to have that, however imperfect, previous Afghan government replaced by the Taliban, knowing that the Taliban is very close to Al-Qaeda, and also knowing that the Islamic State has a very significant presence there now. The Islamic State Khorasan group's numbers have swollen. As the Taliban made their way to Kabul, they broke out every prison, and among those were Islamic State fighters as well as Taliban fighters, and they now number Islamic State somewhere around 2,000, and they indeed carried out the suicide attack at the entry control point to Kabul International Airport that tragically took the lives of 13 of our men and women in uniform and nearly 200 innocent Afghan civilians. And more recently, just over the past weekend, they carried out a terrorist attack in Jalalabad. So they are clearly a threat. The question is, of course, whether they and Al-Qaeda, and of course, they're enemies of each other, but could either of them establish the kind of sanctuary and planning capability that Al-Qaeda had when the Taliban ruled the country in the late 1990s, and when again the 9/11 attacks were planned on Afghan soil, which ultimately required us, since the Taliban refused to expel them, required us to go in and do that. So you have a threat all around the world, and I haven't really touched, there's some specifics in the Indo-Pacific area where we're also helping host nation partners, Philippines and Southern Philippines and so forth, and some others. Keep an eye on this threat, even as we do rightly change our focus to increasingly be on the major development in the Indo-Pacific and the overarching US government effort to establish a coherent, comprehensive whole of governments with an S on the end, so all our partners and allies together policy for China. That's the most important relationship in the world and the most important mission. And if you think of the US as the guy in the circus who gets different plates up and gets them spinning, keeps them spinning, the plate that represents China is bigger than all the others put together. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to keep these other smaller plates spinning, because if you don't, And if you don't keep attention on an extremist threat, as we have learned in the past in Iraq, most significantly, that threat can reconstitute itself. It can do a lot of damage, and it can pose a threat at the very least to our NATO allies in Europe and possibly to our homeland. So that's why we're obviously going to have to keep a very close eye on Afghanistan, and will obviously be much more challenging given that drones are no longer going to be flying out of Kandahar or Bagram. They're going to be flying out of Doha, Qatar, or a base in the UAE. And 60% of the flight time of a Reaper will be taken up just getting to and from Afghanistan, depending on how they're configured, needless to say. So we have to keep that going. We have to keep an eye on them. It's not something where you can declare victory and go home, but you do that in a context in which, you know, we have a renewed great power rivalry situation with China, Russia. You have the continuing threats of North Korea, Iran. And, you know, I haven't included Iran in the Islamist extremist threat. You certainly can, noting that they're obviously Shia rather than Sunni. But certainly what they are doing in supporting groups like Hezbollah, the Shia militia in Iraq, Bashar al-Assad's murderous regime, and the Houthis in Yemen alone, those are very, very damaging and very dangerous as well.
General, that's a really comprehensive answer. I very much appreciate it. I want to follow up on lessons learned. You touched on several lessons learned there. Are there any other lessons that you'd like to share with the audience as you
Sure.
reflected back on the past 20 years?
Yeah, I think there are actually 5 is sort of how I might try to distill these. The first is to acknowledge, to recognize, to be aware that Islamist extremists will exploit ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world or spaces that are governed by like-minded regimes like the Taliban. That will happen. Number 2 is you actually have to do something about it. We have tried at various times to study the problem until it goes away. You know that too. You've also been part of government. You've seen that inclination. The problem is it doesn't go away. And the bigger problem is that Las Vegas rules don't apply in these places. What happens there doesn't stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability. And in a situation like Syria, a geopolitical Chernobyl of a country, spews hundreds of millions, actually, of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into our most important NATO allies in Europe. Number 3 is that the US generally has to lead. That's not to say that there shouldn't be a coalition. There should, and that coalition should include Muslim countries. But actually, as we saw this idea validated in Afghanistan, our NATO partners, many of them wanted to stay in Afghanistan. In fact, they had well over 2 times our forces on the ground. We had, at the most expansive counting rules, 3,500. They had 8,500, but they couldn't stay without us. And that's because we have such a preponderance of the most important capabilities that are needed in these kinds of efforts. We're talking about the top of the line drones. We're talking about a variety of other intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets and capabilities. We're talking about precision close air support and the mechanism. And, you know, it's not enough to put a plane overhead with bombs on it that are precise. You have to have the whole system, you know, the joint tactical controller and a system to ensure you're not going to bomb friendlies or civilians or what have you. And then the ability to fuse intelligence. Again, the US has a unique capacity to bring all different data forms together and to make sense out of them. So the US is going to have to be the leader in most cases. Hats off to the French for what they're doing in Mali, but even that is becoming difficult for them to sustain. And we have at least 1,000 troops engaged in helping them with that. Lesson number 4 is that you have to understand that you cannot counter terrorists like those that I've listed all around the world and truly deal with the root causes with just counter-terrorist force operations. In other words, you can't drone strike or Delta Force raid your way out of the problem. What you have to do is have a comprehensive civil military campaign that gets at those root causes. Now, that's not to say if you can't do that for some reason, and we're not going to be able to do it certainly in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, you still do the disruption and the degradation, which is attacks and potentially raids. But if you really want to resolve the issue, you've got to have that kind of comprehensive campaign. But we do not want any more to be doing the fighting on the front lines. We don't want to be doing the political reconciliation, the restoration of basic services, the repair of damaged infrastructure, and all the rest of that. And indeed, we've figured out how to do that. In Iraq, as I mentioned, we only had about 5,500 troops on the ground, and that was enough to enable the Iraqi security forces, once we got them reconstituted, to take down the Islamic State as an army and to eliminate its caliphate. Same in northeastern Syria with the Syrian Democratic Forces. They did the frontline fighting. They did, again, the restoration of basic services, repair damage. And that's the way it should be, because lesson number 5 is this is a generational struggle, generational fight, not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. You have to have strategic patience and resilience. You have to have a sustained commitment, but that can only be sustained if it is sustainable in 2 metrics, and those are blood and treasure. If you can keep the cost down in terms of our casualties and keep the cost down in terms of dollars, then I don't really think the American public cares that much. The truth is, I think it was something like half of the American population didn't even realize we had troops in Afghanistan anymore. And then you have to get into how you ask the question. If the question is, should we end endless wars? Well, of course we should. You and I want to see that more than anybody else. We know the consequences and sacrifices and losses in war, but it's about how do you end it? Do you end it responsibly? Do you end it in a way that is a decent outcome? Or do you just pull the plug? In any event, if you can have a sustainable approach, you can sustain it. And again, to be fair to this administration and the one before it, by and large, with some back and forth and not the most of coherence at times when it came to, say, Syria or some of the others, or the negotiation on Afghanistan. But by and large, we have kept doing what it is that we need to do, even as we have shifted our focus rightly to the challenges in the Indo-Pacific. So those are the lessons that I think we should have learned. If we had truly embraced them, I think we would have sought an alternative option in Afghanistan. But again, you can relitigate that forever. We are where we are, and we need to focus on the reality that confronts us there now.
So on that last point, Afghanistan, if we could dive a little bit deeper, both you and I and our audience, we can't look into a crystal ball and know what's going to happen in the near term in Afghanistan with a Taliban rule seeking some legitimacy on their part. What do you think, in light of that U.S. withdrawal, the landscape in Afghanistan is going to look like down the line, with the caveat that we don't know, but what's your judgment right now? Winter's coming. Are we in for a humanitarian crisis?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's no question about that, I think. And in truth, in general, this is where I would fall back on a lesson learned from being an economics professor, which is that you can never go wrong by answering a question by saying it depends. And it does depend. It depends on the character, the quality, the moderation of the Taliban leadership. Are they going to take the country back to the 7th century with a very extreme interpretation of Sharia law? Or are they going to be the kinder, gentler Taliban that they have tried to portray themselves as being, even as we are seeing a variety of actions in Kabul and around the country that are very, very worrisome? I mean, telling all the women who work for the government in Kabul not to come back to work unless they are in a task that can only be performed by women, like being an attendant at a women's bathroom or something, that's not particularly heartening. So again, you're going to have to see how this evolves, whether they're going to meet their obligation to ensure that extremists are not allowed to establish a sanctuary. I'm not sure that they have the capacity and capability to prevent the Islamic State from building a sanctuary there. What kind of ISR platforms can they bring to bear? What kind of intelligence? Well, probably pretty good human. But again, do they have the capacity to take on a group like the Islamic State and also to ensure that Al-Qaeda is not projecting attacks outside their country? Is again, there is the beginning of a humanitarian disaster, catastrophe. Afghanistan was already suffering from a drought. In the past, the US and others have funded 75% of the government's operating expenses. The US paid all of the salaries and operating expenses for the Afghan security forces. So they're in real trouble. You could see the lights go out in Kabul because, again, they import electricity from the Central Asian states and refined fuel products from Iran to power generators and so forth. All of that contributes to an enormous trade deficit, which we used to make up and is not going to be the case anymore. And of course, they also have what funds they do have frozen around the world and no access to the IMF special drawing rights that they were expecting or the World Bank loans either. So I think they're in very, very big trouble. I suspect that they are already wistfully thinking about how great it was to be in the opposition, if you will, on the back benches, hurling epithets and IEDs at the party in power. They're now the party in power. They're the dog that after 20 years caught the car and is in the driver's seat. And I think they're going to find out that this is much, much more difficult than was being an insurgent. Being a counterinsurgent is really, really hard. You have to protect population centers and infrastructure everywhere, which is what the Afghans had to do, by the way. And of course, out of that 300,000, they only had about 140,000 troops that actually did that. The rest were police, cops on the beat, border police, customs police, you name it. And their whole system depended on aircraft being able to bring special operations reinforcements, emergency resupply, and close air support. And once we pulled the 18,000 contractors who used to keep the sophisticated US provided systems functioning, it was only a matter of time before you saw this kind of epidemic of collapse that tragically we did see take place in Afghanistan. Keep in mind, by the way, Afghans fought and died for their country in massive numbers, some 27 times the losses that we took. And this is mostly in the last 6 or 7 years since they assumed the frontline fighting across the country. By contrast, we had not had a casualty in the previous 18 months until that tragic explosion at the entry control point at Kabul International Airport. But again, it does depend on how it is that they are going to govern, whether they are going to be, again, a kinder, gentler version of their past self, or if it's going to be some mix where they don't even have complete control over everyone, where the Haqqani network will be rolling its own in the eastern provinces and Kabul, noting that, of course, the Minister of Interior is Siraj Haqqani, who has a $10 million price on his head, and a large number of the other ministers are designated as terrorists in some capacity by some entity around the world.
Yeah, not to mention that the Haqqanis are probably complicit in holding an American hostage.
Yes.
Or hostages.
Yeah.
No, couldn't agree with you more on the challenges to the Taliban on governance. They are going to be challenged.
Yes.
So I'd like to transition just for a moment, and then we will open this up for questions and answers. So Iran, what future challenges does the United States face with Iran presently?
Well, these are really quite considerable, and I think they're coming more and more and more to the fore. Open source analysis says that Iran, when we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, they resumed, after a while, they resumed enrichment of uranium. And they are now back to the point where they are within months or month of having enough uranium, not all at weapons grade, but enough to where they might be a month or so away from being able to have the material for a bomb. Now, there's always been an open question, do they actually have the capacity, the technology, the know-how to build a bomb, to have a trigger and that will, set off the chain reaction? Again, there are estimates of that, but it is very, very worrisome. They're much, much closer to actually having that kind of device. And then do they have the means to deliver it is another question. But however you assess this, the trajectory that they are on is very worrisome. And keep in mind, the whole reason that we did an Iran nuclear deal, the big rationale that President Obama offered, which was reasonable, is look, if we don't do a deal, we're going to have to carry out a military operation. And there is nothing small about taking out the Iran nuclear enrichment sites, the other infrastructure, and then what do you do about the ballistic missile and air defense sites? What do you do about their capacity to respond? I mean, you can very quickly get into something that is quite substantial. And we built that plan. It's publicly known. It's long enough ago now that when I was U.S. Central Command that we built this in the beginning. Obviously, the air defenses with the introduction of the sophisticated Russian air defense are considerably better now and would be more difficult to take down. But we have to get serious about that again. And I'm sure that Central Command is very, very keenly focused on this and going through what it has to do, making preparations for the possibility of what we used to call, when you and I were out there, setting the theater to be ready to carry out this kind of operation. If we cannot get back to the Iran nuclear deal, which of course had some significant shortcomings, specifically the end dates, the sunset clauses for different elements of that deal. And those sunset clauses and elements are, a good 5 or 6 years or whatever closer now than they were before. But that's an either or. The administration wants to go longer and stronger. In other words, a stronger agreement that also ideally would address the missile program and also the malign activities of the Shia militia that Iran is supporting in places again, such as Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, to name a few. So the nuclear program is, I think, becoming once again a very, very significant concern for the United States. And Iran, which of course went through a presidential election, has a more hardline president now. The appointments that he has made are not particularly encouraging when it comes to this kind of negotiation, but that's become much more important. Meanwhile, we are still very concerned that Iran is really bent on doing in Iraq, in Syria, and Yemen what it did in Lebanon, which is in a sense to Lebanonize Iraq, as an example, to use the Shia militia for street cred, street power, the same way they have Hezbollah, one huge militia force in Lebanon, and to get similar power in the Iraqi Council of Representatives, their parliament, to where you have the equivalent of what they have in Beirut, which is a blocking veto. So no legislation that they oppose can go through anymore. And they'd love to have the same. They would like to Lebanonize Iraq. Now, as you know, from serving there, the Iraqis do not want to be the 51st state of Iran. They are very, very sensitive to Iran's ambitions. They are resisting those, but this is a formidable challenge for the land of the two rivers. And then, of course, you have Yemen, where their support for the Houthis, their provision to the Houthis of a variety of different drones, missiles, and other systems has made life very, very difficult for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And then propping up Bashar al-Assad, just when it appeared that he was really shaky in the early years of the Syrian civil war, they held him up. They brought in the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force advisors, some actual Revolutionary Guards Corps fighters. Then they brought in Hezbollah, and ultimately, of course, Russian air power and special operations forces solidified Bashar's capabilities. They're not going to reunite Syria anytime soon. They really don't seem to have the capability to truly regain control of the whole country. So it's going to be a situation of Humpty Dumpty, has fallen off the wall, and we don't know if it can be put back together again. It's an open question. But again, their hand is very much at play there. And of course, they'd love to solidify their control across the Shia crescent. So from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and then down into southern Lebanon. And they'd love to have a ground line of communications that would enable them to do that. And they have used the Shia militia in Iraq to try to solidify their control on a ground line of communications like that. Although certainly our occasional actions and Israel's more frequent actions have disrupted that effort a fair amount over the years.
Well, thank you for those insights. Really appreciate hearing them, albeit they are very sober. sobering. Amanda, do you want to go ahead and reach out to our audience and pass us some questions for the General and I?
I do, but I believe my tech ops has to turn on my video. But I'm here, so I will go. You can hear me, right?
No way, we can hear you fine.
All right. So we have a lot of really excellent questions.
Now, I hope the first one is from the great Navy Captain John Burnham, with whom Chris and I both had the privilege of serving when he was commanding the U.S. Navy's Special Mission Unit, with which he spent a lot of time over the years. So if you can bring his question to the top of the list, that would be great.
Well, as he quickly gets it in, I will start with one that beat him to it, which is a question about wondering about whether there are overly optimistic reports over the years in Afghanistan, and wondering if there are safeguards against groupthink in the military, and are there channels where people can dissent?
Yeah, look, first of all, this comparisons to what the Washington Post has put out and the Pentagon Papers are just not sensible, frankly. The Pentagon Papers were highly classified papers written by a very small group of people and then assembled with lots of other documents, in a sense, to document the activities of the war and what people were saying inside the Pentagon at the time at the top secret level about them. And when those were, they were brought out painstakingly and copied one by one back in the technology of the day by the New York Times and finally released. Those were real sort of mind-blowing, you're kidding me. They were saying this publicly and thinking this privately. The papers in which the Washington Post were based were series of interviews with commanders and diplomats and others, starting, I think it was around 2014 and up. They were off the record, but they were not, again, top secret or code word or anything remotely like that. Now, certainly the commanders and diplomats were speaking, again, as I said, off the record, but then this was allowed to go into the record. And it's not entirely surprising that there's a bit of a can-do spirit in the military that we have to resist, frankly. First, with the truth. We're not going to put lipstick on pigs. If you look at the public statements that I made, and I have recently, when all the Washington Post reports broke, I stand by what I told Congress. I stand by what I told behind closed doors in the White House, because it's all come out in memoirs by former Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of State, and some others. I can't, I wasn't involved in the details, obviously, from 2014 on, because I'd left government by then. There's certainly fault. There's no question that there were mistakes over the years in Afghanistan. There's also no question that, some of those were on my watch, and I have tried to be forthright about that. In fact, I would note up front, for those who have studied Afghanistan closely, my view is that we did not even get the inputs right in Afghanistan. Inputs, not outputs. Inputs right until late 2010. That is 9 years after we invaded Afghanistan. And of course, that's principally because we very quickly pivoted to focus on Iraq, and then Iraq became all consuming. I'm part of that problem. During the surge, we needed every single force that the US could provide from all services, and we got them. And it wasn't until the end of the surge and driving violence down by 85% in Iraq that we could then shift that focus and begin a buildup in Afghanistan, a country in which we'd been sort of shooting behind the target the entire time that we were there. And I did an assessment in Afghanistan on the way home from my 3-star tour in Iraq. And at Secretary Rumsfeld's request, I came back and briefed him. And I was astonished that operation that had begun, year and a half or more before the Iraq invasion, was way behind in a variety of different of the programs and initiatives, particularly in the train and equip program. And there were some real issues there. The focus on the number trained rather than the number who were actually on active duty was a pretty big shortcoming, because it turned out that they were losing ground in the training of the Afghan security forces rather than gaining ground. In other words, the force structure itself was actually declining because we're focused on the metric of those that are trained and not those that are still with the force, because you have casualties, AWOLs, they leave the service, what have you, at the end of their tour. And there were a whole host of other issues, and he took those very seriously. But I also laid out, by the way, which is relevant for Afghanistan and which I shared with Congress some years later, I said, Afghanistan is not equal to Iraq. That was the first slide of this briefing. The context is vastly more difficult. Number one, the enemy is beyond your grasp. The Taliban sanctuary was outside Quetta in Pakistan. The capital of Baluchistan is Quetta. The Haqqani network was in North Waziristan and the federally administered tribal areas, as was Al-Qaeda, as was the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan and various others. Hekmatyar's guys were there as well until we reconciled with them. So, and then beyond that, this is a country that has no money. Iraq could generate $100 billion in oil revenue if it stayed at $105 a barrel. And we got it back to that during the surge. It's a country that had infrastructure. Afghanistan had none. It's a country that had lots of base structure from the Iran-Iraq war that we could occupy. Again, nothing like that really in Afghanistan, despite the war with the Soviet Union. And of course, Afghanistan had very high illiteracy, very little human capital, and not much of a memory of strong central government, although we were very sensitive to try to create government, if you will, that was Afghan, not a mirror image of ourselves. So again, over time, was there probably, again, over-optimism? Yes, I suspect that was the case. And, it in some cases was not proper, without question. Again, you should be first with the truth, shoot straight with the American public and the coalition public. Was some of this driven by an inclination at the top? Sure. We renamed an operation, basically, we just kept doing it. That's to denote that the Afghans were now doing the frontline fighting. I mean, it's a legitimate issue, and then we always had this unreasonable desire to end endless wars before they could be ended. Look, again, we're all for ending endless wars, those who have actually served in them more than anyone else. The problem is, how do you end the endless war? And you don't do it just by ending your involvement in the endless war, because that may lead to an outcome, as we saw in Afghanistan, that is not one that you would like to see. So I share the concerns of the questioner and, frankly, of the Washington Post writers who produced those documents and analyzed them and assessed them. But I also think there's a little bit of human nature that is really, really hard to suppress if people give, years of their life to something, and when they're walking away from it, of course we made progress. Well, sometimes you have to walk away and say, we didn't actually achieve what we hoped to achieve. And if you look at my statements during that time, now, of course, I was fortunate to have the inputs right for the first time and to have 150,000 coalition troops. We should have made progress, and we did. But it was measured, and it was qualified, and it was very, very carefully tailored and described to make sure that we didn't get overly expansive. We'd done that in Afghanistan as well, and it bit us in the backside, and we had to reestablish our credibility during the early months of the surge.
If I could just jump in there, just to reinforce a point or two. In the summer of 2017, there was no rosy picture at the White House. I can underscore that point. And yet, before a decision was made to hold talks with the Taliban in Qatar, the President of the United States, then President Trump, made a decision to provide more troops to Afghanistan, different resources, a new strategy was rolled out. There was no rosy picture of what was happening in Afghanistan, to the general's point. And yet we recognized the mission was changing somewhat. We wanted to ensure that we continued counterterrorism pressure. It was all through the lens of counterterrorism at the time. And we are worried about where we are today because we don't have a US presence. So all that said, it's important to note there was another opportunity for a year or two to continue with different resources applied to the problem, building an Air Force. And General McMaster has talked a lot about this, and he also, along with the General Petraeus, has spoken about the withdrawal on the ground in Afghanistan recently. So it's important to understand that transition to where the Trump White House got to the point where ultimately they decided that they had to hold talks with the Taliban in Qatar. So it's an interesting dynamic. I too have read the Afghanistan papers. All of that said, it really didn't comprehensively lay out the way I saw things, certainly in the summer of 2017.
But of course, unfortunately, what you participated in and contributed to, ultimately a year or two later was not continued.
That's exactly right.
Complete difference with a withdrawal that was not fully warranted to that level and so forth. Although still, again, there was the option even then certainly to have continued. The current administration, to their credit, returned to the WHO. They reversed a lot of policies of the previous administration that I think were proper, that they've done the right thing. Back to the WHO, back to the Paris Climate Accord, trying to get back to the Iran nuclear deal. That's a little bit more arguable, but again, I think preferable to having to destroy the nuclear program, and stayed in all these other places, and even probably plussed up a tiny bit in Somalia, and yet on this one felt that they were constrained by that agreement, which I think has to rank with among the worst diplomatic agreements in our history, frankly.
All right, General and Chris, we do have the sought after question from our friend John Burnham. And he mentions that you touched on over the horizon targeting as a stand-in for troop presence. And he's wondering, can you talk more about that as an extended option in the region, how new technology will affect it, what it means for potential intel sharing relationships with the Taliban in Pakistan?
Well, look, I'd love to see the Taliban demonstrate that they are right with us in keeping Islamist extremists from exploiting spaces over which they presumably will have governance responsibilities. And I think a great step forward would be for the Taliban to say, hey, US, why don't you come back to Bagram Air Base? We don't have anything going on there. We'll work with you. And you go after Al-Qaeda and you go after the Islamic State. I think that would be a pretty powerful statement. I don't expect to hear it anytime soon. It's not coming through a theater near us, I don't think. But that would be great because as our shipmate, John Burnham, understands better than probably anybody else in this call, even some of the intelligence professionals with great respect, human intelligence is hugely important. And it's not just that we've lost our bases and our embassy and all the other lily pads and footprints and so forth within which intelligence professionals could operate, and special mission unit operators and humaniters. We've lost every base that we had in Central Asia. We're no longer in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, or Pakistan, in addition to being no longer in Afghanistan. And again, the nearest bases that we have from which we can fly intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, strike aircraft, and so forth, unless there's an aircraft carrier parked off Pakistan, which is very, very expensive and a huge opportunity cost because it should be out in the Indo-Pacific. But otherwise, we have to depend on bases right now in Qatar or the UAE. It's possible we could get a little bit closer with a base in Oman. We'll see what develops. But even then, again, you're going to spend 50 to 60% of the flying time of the top of the line drones, Reapers, just getting to and from Afghanistan, as opposed to, in that unblinking eye orbit, focused on something that has real importance and is of concern to us. But keep in mind that when you're looking at something through the soda straw optics of a drone, you may or may not understand what you're actually seeing. I have been in circumstances where we have had drones and I'm looking at the feed, but because we had nobody on the ground explaining to us what was happening, in fact, over Benghazi, Libya, that fateful night, we repositioned drones, we're watching it, but it was really hard to tell without somebody on the ground with the feed explaining to you what you are seeing, whether those guys with guns on the back of a pickup truck are good guys or bad guys or in between guys. And the same is the challenge that we're going to have in Afghanistan. Now, yes, we have lots of other sources and methods in the age of digital dust and digital footprints and the internet and all kinds of other possibilities that we're going to have to mine very, very assiduously to keep some idea of what's going on. And at some point, we are going to have to piece back together human networks and reactivate some of those relationships that we had, noting that a lot of those individuals were taken out of the country because of the risk to them and to their families. So the challenge is, again, John is exactly on to this, and I think behind his question is a degree of awareness, more than a degree of awareness, a keen sensitivity to how difficult it is going to be to keep an eye on these different groups as they try to reestablish sanctuaries, something they have repeatedly tried to do. And we beat back al-Qaeda in Eastern Afghanistan a couple of times over the years, including when I was the commander there and then when I was the CIA director. The Islamic State threat, the Khorasan group, is a more recent addition to the mix out there. But as I mentioned, they're at strength of 2,000, having benefited from all these prison breaks that the Taliban conducted en route to Kabul. They're very, very dangerous. They're dangerous also to Afghans and Afghan civilians and indeed to the Taliban. But if they can establish the kind of capability that they had, for example, in Mosul or Raqqa in Iraq or northeastern Syria, with a virtual caliphate that can inspire, direct, guide, share tactics, techniques, and procedures with like-minded individuals in, say, Western Europe, or maybe even in the United States, that's very, very worrisome. And we saw that from the Islamic State Caliphate that was established in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. So this will be a huge priority. I mean, if you just think about the domestic political implications of an attack came out of the country from which we withdrew, that would be enormous. And so the intelligence community writ large and the military, especially the special mission unit capabilities and units, are going to have to devote considerable resources. It'll be interesting, in fact, to see what the relative cost is to what it was that the cost of maintaining 3,500 troops and supporting an Afghan government that allowed us to have those bases and was an ally in the fight against extremism.
Yeah, I too share the general's concern in the underlining premise of John's question. The bottom line is, having met with many defecting Taliban, handled them on the ground in Afghanistan, I remain significantly concerned without those abilities, without those capabilities, we aren't really going to be able to rely on the Taliban, at least as it looks now, to go after ISIS-K. You have to have the on-the-ground capabilities. That said, small footprints, with the capability to debrief an individual face-to-face, sitting with those individuals. So it remains to be seen how this plays out, not just in Afghanistan, but elsewhere. So I appreciate the general making those points, rather.
We have a wide variety of questions about China. Everything, will they fill the void left by the contractors? What will how will they engage in Afghanistan? To, are we going to engage on land and sea with the Chinese, or merely, compete in space and cyber? So pretty much anything you can tell us in our limited amount of time, gentlemen, about your China thoughts?
First of all, in terms of Afghanistan, it's well known that they went in and surveyed Bagram Air Base already. I'm sure they have an entree there if they want it. I think they will be deliberate and cautious in doing this. There is history of China in Afghanistan. We know it. In fact, when I was there, they had invested a couple $2 billion in a copper mine just south of Kabul in northern Logar province. They were on the receiving end of incoming mortars and rockets from the Taliban and the Haqqani network, and they left. Now, presumably, with the source of instability and attacks in charge, perhaps they can return. But I think, again, they're going to be cautious about this. They certainly do not want, I don't think, to put combat forces on the ground. They would love to get access to the 2 trillion, that's, again, trillions with an S on the end, of minerals that are in the ground, especially lithium, rare earths, and others that are becoming increasingly important in an age of electric vehicles and cell phones and all the rest of that. But again, it remains to be seen whether they can actually develop the extractive capital intensive input there, whether they can find enough human capital. And keep in mind, it's probably unlikely that they fund in the way that the US, Japan, UK, and others did the Afghan government directly. Their model generally with the Belt and Road Initiative is to loan countries money so that those countries pay them to do infrastructure deals that generally benefit not just the country, but also China. Think of the port at Gwadar, think of the port in Sri Lanka, some others of these that are the model for that. And indeed, they already have at least a vision of connecting from China through Pakistan, again, down to the Indian Ocean, if you will. I again think they will be fairly deliberate in doing this. And I don't think you're going to see them change their model so significantly that all of a sudden they are keeping the lights on in Kabul or keeping the Afghan government or Afghan security forces paid and so forth. As to whether or not we have real conflict, look, I think one challenge, one concern as a result of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which followed, at least according to our NATO partners, some of the most important ones, the UK in particular, which followed an inadequate amount of consultation. You heard Tom Tugendhat in the parliament in London. You heard the Minister of Defense, open criticism. And so clearly there has been a bit of a blow to our credibility, our reputation as a partner. And again, China has understandably seized on this. They have long said the US is a power in decline. It is an undependable partner. And they said, just look at what happened in Afghanistan. By the way, Taiwan, take note of that. You're going to depend on these guys. So it's incumbent on the US. And I'm sure this administration has some very, very high, uniformly high quality people, I would contend. And those individuals clearly recognize the reputational damage that we have suffered as a result of this. And indeed, the Australia, UK, US agreement is a significant response to that, noting that that also, unfortunately, seemed to have an inadequate degree of consultation between Australia and France, with whom Australia had a contract that was seen as very, very significant to the French, which resulted in the French doing something they've never done in their relationship with us, which is to withdraw their ambassador from Washington and also their ambassador from Canberra. So deterrence at its heart is a function of 2 factors. It's the perception, the adversary, potential adversary's perception of your capabilities and your willingness to employ those capabilities. The withdrawal from Afghanistan does not enhance the adversary's perception of our will. So again, we're going to have to be conscious of that. I'm sure that we can repair whatever damage has been done. And to be fair, this administration had prior to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, done quite a masterful job of engaging at the very top level with the Quad virtual summit, with other Indo-Pacific partners and allies, again, at the presidential level, the G7 summit in person, the EU summit in person, the NATO summit in person, you know, bilateral with the UK, bilateral with Russia, preparatory to building out this coherent, comprehensive whole of governments with an S on the end approach to China. That is the overarching big idea guiding this administration rightly. And generally, I think, doing a good job, with the exception that there should be a trade component. I understand the domestic political challenges of, but we should be back in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, especially as we see China offered to enter that on their own. Probably unlikely, given the rules of entry, but we will see whether they're willing to make the changes and able to assuage the concerns of countries such as Australia to enable that. But we should be in that first. It's the one biggest component missing from that comprehensive whole of governments approach when it comes to the relationship with China and our allies and partners all together in doing that.
Good, Amanda. Can we take another question?
We are going to do something so fast in our 3 minutes. We have a lot of young people watching. We have a whole class in West Virginia, college class, watching really fast. What advice do you give to people looking for a career in counterterrorism, national security? And do you have a book recommendation? It's a twofer.
The advice is, you know, be #1 in your class, Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude, and you still are going to be competing with about 119 other people to get into the CIA or the other great agencies that make up our intelligence and law enforcement and military communities. In all honesty, I mean, life is a competitive endeavor, and you don't, in the real world, get a trophy just for showing up. It's not little kids soccer. There's no T-shirt for those who come in, you know, 3rd or 4th. Now, you should compete not just to be the best that you can be, but also the best team player that you can be, without question. But again, if people are really serious about getting into the, you know, the greatest privilege, I think of an American, that any American can experience, is to serve one's country in uniform, in the agency, in the other agencies, and federal law enforcement and so forth. And it is very, very simple. I mean, if you have to know the odds, you have to know the competition, you have to understand how fiercely competitive it is to get into the best of these organizations, or to get into John Burnham's old outfit. I mean, assessment and selection is not a trivial affair. And if you really want to guarantee it, be #1 in your class and summa cum laude. As to a book, I would pick a biography in the field that the individual wants to enter. I've often noted that Grant Takes Command by Bruce Catton was hugely influential on me during the early tough months of the surge, because I'm living with Grant what he went through, you know, the horrific casualties, the political interference, the enemy gets a vote, and the sheer determination that he brought. For example, at Bloody Shiloh, where he and Sherman almost driven back into the Tennessee River, and Sherman comes out of the dark to him, and Grant is standing under a tree. You know, it's an infantryman's experience that you're waiting for the sun to come up. All the available cover is being used as makeshift hospitals. You can hear the cries of the wounded, limbs being amputated. And Sherman says to Grant, "Well, General, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we?" And Grant says, "Yep. Lick them tomorrow, though." And that actually became a metaphor for us in the surge in Iraq during very, very tough days. So I would commend a biography in that field that an individual is going to pursue, because that can be really instructive, informative, and build the intellectual capital, or contribute to the intellectual capital that someone needs to be all that he or she can be in that particular field.
That's hard to follow, but I'm just going to offer very briefly, since my students from Georgetown might be tuning in, and these these folks that are in West Virginia might not be happy with what I'm going to say, but do your readings, because it'll provide you a competitive advantage when you go to the White House and you're making recommendations on counterterrorism or whatever it is you're studying. I promise you it will become a competitive advantage. And the book that I recommend for this month in particular is Peter Bergen, who happens to be a good friend of mine. He wrote an excellent book called The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden, and I put it on my reading list for my students at Georgetown. It's a rich book, and it'll provide some context for all of us. It'll remind us where we've been these past 20 years. So thank you very much, General. This has been extraordinary. Thanks for helping us educate the public, which is our mission. I will turn it back to Amanda to make sure she says those final things that she does so well.
Let me just say the privilege is mine, Chris, and great book choice. I also hold Peter Bergen in very, very, very high regard. One of the few, of course, who actually interviewed Osama bin Laden some years before we brought him to justice in the final months that I was privileged to command, and of course done by John Burnham's guys, albeit that night working for the CIA rather than the military, because it was outside our area of responsibility, which is limited to Afghanistan. But you know, what an extraordinarily memorable occasion that was.
I think John Burnham needs a t-shirt that says, "I was name checked a lot in Spycast today."
More than earned it.
Well, it has been incredible to hear from you both. This has been an incredibly stimulating spy chat, and we want to thank once again the Honorable Mary Beth Long and Accenture Federal Services for giving us a chance to have programs like this with incredible people for free. If you would like to support the Spy Museum, we'd be happy to receive your donation. We are working just like everyone else to get things back to normal and to help educate the public. We have a lot of cool programs coming up. We have something very different on October 14th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to talk about the Cold War and why it matters still to this day. So thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. Thanks for all those questions, which we will share with Chris and the General independently afterwards, because we had well over 30 and we got to about 4. So thanks everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.